For Donald Trump and his legal team, the federal election interference case has turned into a race against the clock. Ever since charges were handed down in this case 4 months ago, the ex-president has seen returning to the White House as his best defense. No one is more aware of this dynamic than the special counsel, Jack Smith, which is why the Justice Department today took a major step. Just a few hours ago, Jack Smith asked the Supreme Court to rule on Donald Trump's bid to have the charges thrown out because the alleged crimes took place while he was president. Now, this is not new. You'll recall that Judge Tanya Chutkan had rejected that claim, and Trump has appealed. Now Jack Smith is asking the nation's highest court to leapfrog the appeals court that is currently set to decide the issue and settle the matter once and for all. The special counsel's move potentially setting up the first, but maybe not the last time the Supreme Court plays a role in United States versus Donald Trump. Prosecutors say, quote, this case presents a fundamental question at the heart of our democracy. Whether a former president is absolutely immune from federal prosecution for crimes committed while in office or is constitutionally protected from federal prosecution when he's been impeached by the House but not convicted by the Senate before criminal proceedings begin. It is of imperative public importance that respondents' claim of impunity be resolved by this court and that respondent's trial proceeds as promptly as possible if his claim of immunity is rejected. Respondents' claims are profoundly mistaken, as the district court held, but only this court can definitively resolve them, end quote. As the New York Times reports, the request was unusual in two ways. Mr. Smith asked the justices to rule before an appeals court acted, and he urged them to move with exceptional speed, end quote. Goes back to Trump's defense strategy, which is fundamentally more about politics than it is about the law. As the Times notes, quote, if the trial were to be put off until after the 2024 election and Mr. Trump were to win, he could just have his attorney general simply dismiss the charges. Holding a trial after the presidential race would also mean that voters would never hear any of the evidence that prosecutors have collected about Mr. Trump's expansive efforts to reverse the results of the last election before weighing in on whether to reelect him, end quote. And that's where we start today with Politico national correspondent Betsy Woodruff Swan. Plus, with me at the table, former top prosecutor at the Department of Justice, Andrew Weissmann, and MSNBC legal analyst Lisa Rubin. Welcome to all of you. Thank you for being with us. Andrew, let me just start with you. How unusual is this? We're used to seeing things proceed. We understand the wheels of justice move a little slowly, but we're used to seeing a ruling, an appeal, and then maybe it goes to the Supreme Court. How unusual is this leapfrogging?
Everything about this is unusual. Right. In order to understand this, what you need to understand is that there is an automatic stay pending the Court of Appeals decision. That would mean that the trial that is currently scheduled for March 4th could not go forward unless the Court of Appeals ruled. Then, if you wait for that, you then have the ability of Trump to seek the Supreme Court to review it. This has no downside for Jack Smith, which is basically going under a Supreme Court rule that allows you to do that leapfrogging in exceptional circumstances to say, in order to keep this date, you should just hear it, because you're either going to decide you need to hear it later, in which case, like, why not just decide this now? Right. You don't really need the Court of Appeals decision. Or you're going to say, you know what, the Supreme Court's not going to weigh in at all. But either way, better to know that now. Right. Because the whole ball of wax is timing. Because it doesn't even matter if the Supreme Court were to agree with the district court, but it doesn't rule on this for many, many, many months. Right. It won't happen before the election.
You and I had a very interesting conversation, not about this case, about something we're going to talk about later in the show, about some cases in which the timing means everything. You and I were talking about pregnancy and abortion.
That's right.
But actually, this is similar, because what Jack Smith is the point here is that something's going to happen. Whether the trial starts on March 4th or not, something's going to happen potentially in November, which could render this whole case, problematic.
That's exactly right. And Smith doesn't say that outright, but he does say that the timing absolutely matters, because there's a statement in this brief saying no person is above the law. That is the principle on which the special counsel's office has undertaken this case. And if it means something, we have to vindicate that principle now by ensuring that this person can be tried in a timely manner.
Betsy, let's talk about a lot of your reporting about the degree to which Jack Smith pushed back on Trump's arguments, mainly arguments that say that are reasons why this shouldn't go to trial, including his immunity and his First Amendment issues that he keeps on claiming.
Yeah, that's right. One thing I can tell you is that there's a name that I guarantee every legal expert and advisor around Trump noticed from this brief the second it went online, and that is Michael Dreeben. Michael Dreeben is one of the lawyers who filed this brief before the Supreme Court on behalf of Jack Smith's team. He's listed as a member of Smith's team, and he's really important because he was also a top attorney working on special counsel Robert Mueller's investigation. This is actually Dreeben's second tour of duty working on a special counsel investigation looking at Trump. Previously, Dreeben was a top lawyer in the Justice Department's Office of Solicitor General. He's argued before the Supreme Court more than 100 times. Back when I was writing about him during the Mueller probe, one person I spoke to described him as a legal demigod, somebody who really knows the absolute inside outs of the Supreme Court and the way it interacts with almost any criminal justice issue that you could possibly imagine. The fact that he is now working with Jack Smith's team on this high stakes project is really notable, and of course has not whatsoever gone unnoticed in broader Trump legal world. When it comes to what happens next on the Supreme Court piece of this, of course, there are two different tracks that Trump's team views this project as moving along, the legal and the political. And while there's a lot of overlap, of course, between those, and they have significant implications for each other, from the Trump world vantage point, they're separate. In terms of the politics, I spoke with a Trump advisor earlier today after this brief came down, who said, frankly, they aren't that stressed about the political impact. They look at some of these polls that have come out that have been bruising for President Biden, and they feel that this legal fight is not necessarily existential for him, at least in terms of where the Supreme Court comes down. But then on the side of how is it going to play out in court, what arguments will Trump teams make, I would expect, I think people can reasonably predict that the arguments they'll make on this Supreme Court piece of it are going to be consistent with what they've been arguing, which is Jack Smith's trying to move too fast, and that's very unfair to Trump himself. This is an argument they've been making for the entirety of Smith's investigation. I would expect them to continue pushing that argument forward. And of course, now it's going to be up to the Supreme Court to decide whether or not that holds water.
I saw you posting about Dreeben earlier today. You must know him.
Of course. So I worked very closely with him on Special Counsel Mueller's investigation. He was head of the legal team. I actually was the person who came up with the idea of bringing him on because, I mean, you don't get any better than him. It's notable because he is actually, in this case, he is leaving private practice to go back to the government to work on this. So they have the very, very top legal talent on this case. One thing that Betsy said that I think is notable is this idea that Donald Trump will say this is going too fast. I think that's going to be very difficult in the appeal brief that was just filed by Jack Smith. This is why. It is really in everyone's interest to have this decided quickly. The former president is saying, I am immune from criminal prosecution. Double jeopardy has attached. I should not be subject to this criminal case at all. I shouldn't be under bail restrictions. I shouldn't be under a gag order. I shouldn't have to participate in this.
So by extension, the sooner this ends.
Exactly. In other words, I am harmed every single day this exists. To then turn around and say, I don't want the Supreme Court to decide this quickly, is really at odds with what he is saying legally. So you actually have Jack Smith saying decide it quickly. There's a public interest in speedy trials. And you would think that any defendant making these arguments would want it as well. So it puts, obviously, Donald Trump is certainly capable of saying inconsistent things, but it puts his lawyers in a bit of a trick box as to how they're going to actually oppose this.
Unless he, back to square one, unless he doesn't actually want it settled soon because he's worried that this could go against him and being in office. This does change the game. I mean, being reelected without the public's ability to evaluate the evidence against him as it relates to the 2020 election is a serious matter. And this could never see the light of day again if Donald Trump becomes president.
That's certainly true. And to dovetail off something that Andrew just said, one of the other reasons that Trump's folks are going to have a hard time with their timing argument that this is going too fast is because of one precedent here that Jack Smith's team cites, and that's the Nixon case. When the Watergate tapes were litigated in 1974, the time between the district court's decision and the Supreme Court's opinion, which was on an application by a special counsel for certiorari pending judgment, was roughly 8 weeks.
Right.
So there's no argument that they can make, at least historically, that this never has been done before, that no special counsel has asked for this before. Indeed, our Democratic Republic has survived a litigation exactly like this, brought for reasons very much like this.
Betsy, something you think about all the time, for people who follow polls, and I'm not one of them that follows them as closely as everybody else does a year out from an election, but the trends do not indicate that Donald Trump is politically hurt by any of this. And in these polls, like one that was released today, where people were asked about if he were convicted, would this be an issue, or do his legal problems implicate him further? People who don't think so, don't think so. Like their minds don't change on this matter.
Yeah, and the Trump advisor I spoke to said that what we're going to see in the next few months, and this is true, is a really interesting test of conventional wisdom of folks in the political analysis community, shall we say. When the Mar-a-Lago raid happened way back when, it feels like ancient history now, and then these 4 indictments came out one after another, the initial response and the initial conventional wisdom was maybe this will help Trump in the Republican primary, where it will activate his base and generate very heightened emotional responses from the right, but surely it would hurt him in the general election. And that was a very widely held view. What we're seeing now, and again, to your point, these are very early polls. It's not election day yet. It's a long way to go. But what we're seeing now, particularly with this Wall Street Journal poll that just came out, are indicators that actually these indictments, these legal proceedings, don't seem to be overwhelmingly bad for Trump. And that's something of an understatement. In other words, this legal process does not seem to have inflicted any sort of political damage of this scale, at least, again, at this point, that many people predicted back when these indictments were first rolled out.
I'm curious.